I was hoping with this being probably my last competitive event that I could break my curse of getting ninth or 10th place and finally hit top 8 at a GP. Well, if anything, I guess I'm consistent. Prior to the GP, I had been messing with Brunhild variants, mostly with ways to tech unique runes via Omniscience Stone. There really aren't too many cards you can play with it for cheap, as a lot of good stuff requires 2 of its respective color. But Diverse Evolution actually reduces its water cost and not its void cost when played from the rune deck, so I started to experiment with that. Diverse Evolution states that you target resonators up to the amount of unique races on resonators you control, then you put one 100-100 counter on the first, 2 on the second, 3 on the third, and so on. Despite the somewhat awkward wording on the card, this is one of the most disgusting runes in the game and can give spam decks a potential OTK if used properly. There are a few ways to win an event in a wide open meta. Make less mistakes than anyone else, anticipate the metagame correctly, or run splash cards that others won't expect that can shift the tide of the game in your favor. I damn well know I'm not the first, and threw the second out the window the minute I picked Brunhild into Lucifer, so I fell back onto the last one and put most of my chips on Diverse being a big enough surprise to clutch me some games. The majority of the deck shares its shell with the aggro Brunhild list that topped in Vegas, mostly because a lot of those resonators don't share races with each other. Sorceress is a were-rabbit, Hare is a were-rabbit in Fairy Tale, Air is a Valkyrie, Orvica a Dragonoid, and so on and so on. The only real change was adding in Venus, who has 2 unique races with Historical and 7 Luminary. I also like that Venus replaces herself, which is important when most of the decks predicted to show are going to try and discard cards out of my hand. Besides Diverse, the only real out-of-place rune is Turn Tail. I settled on this card as an answer to removal. Honestly, it ended up being used more as a combo piece with Orphica to let her blink things through her own effect rather than to actually save stuff. Orphica's pretty useful in general. Outside of being able to have a pseudo-Lumi effect for your things, she can also blink things on your opponent's side of the field if you want to remove potential blockers. The only issue is that without Quick Cast, Orphica can't really be used as a response, which isn't too bad, but would have been kind of cool. Everything else worth saying about this deck has probably already been said by better channels, so let's just move on to the tournament report. My first match was against a player who was brand new to the game. Their deck was a mashup of the Light and Darkness starters with a few cards from various sets splashed in. Their stone lineup seemed to be a split of 5-5 between Light and Darkness, which screwed them over pretty hard in both games we played. Their removal options seemed a bit limited too. I never saw them use a single Blade of Faith or Spear of the Valkyrie, and just waited for them to flip over Odin's Judgment before committing to going wide in both games. I'm a fan of aggressive Reanimator Brunhild, but I don't know if I'd consider it a meta call like it was at the start of the cluster. White gives Brunhild so many tools now that I don't think she has to splash heavily into other colors to be a threat. Her primary weakness is her lack of a reliable board wipe outside of her rune, but her strengths in swarm potential, life gain, and protection oftentimes make up for that. Inexperience was definitely a major factor of my win here, but I'm glad to see Force of Will is still pulling in new players, and I would say the metagame is definitely in the best place it's ever been. While Tigris was able to beat out a lot of the Mistletoe Brunhild decks in Vegas, he struggles against a lot of aggro decks if he doesn't draw well. Tigris is a deck that benefits from slower matches since it gives him time to build up a large number of gems to use when he flips. My aim here was not to give him that opportunity, and it's pretty easy to do when your deck is 20% one-cost resonators. In Game 1, I went as wide as possible while holding onto my ears to re-establish my board after I knew he would try to wipe me. By turn 5 he flipped, cleared my board, and set up to swing big the next turn, but I was able to quickly set back up with Ear into Orphica into Hare and then playing a Venus and Sorceress from my hand. Without a reliable wipe left, I simply had to block Tigris' swing, then slap even more units on the field and Diverse for the kill. Game 2 went heavily into my favor as he didn't draw into any bodyguards, and without a way to quickly build up gems, it was easy to keep my field established. I was able to flip Diverse before he could flip Tigris in this case. I personally feel Tigris is in the same position as Brunhild. He is great in a format where decks like Keurig, who can be sided around, or Hanzo, who lack answers to your gimmick, are expected to be the main. He falters in control-centric metas like Lucifer, though. Making use of easy color fixing through Gem Mallet gives Tigris plenty of possible side options that a lot of other players wouldn't expect. For example, you're already pumping out darkness gems. Running something like Evil Elemental to punish Brunhild or Reanimator Lucifer can easily help secure a victory. Honestly, I think Shinshin and Ray Ray combo would have been a better choice for this particular GP. Look of Corruption can't rip your main combo piece out of your hand because of its cost, and if you generate enough gems, you can have a field of several 1k attack pandas to finish off your opponent a turn or two before they'd be able to slap down Belial. Round 3 didn't really happen. See, the downside to living outside of the country is that most of my cards don't look like this, they look like this. While I realize I'm responsible for providing legible proxies of my cards, it's a thought that slipped my mind. Japan's table rules are way laxer than in the West, and I tend to have JPEG versions of all my cards on my phone if my opponent needs them. Of course, most of those JPEGs typically are in Japanese. Japanese players also tend to be trusting. In cases where a card has to be explained, most people will just take your word for it, because I guess malicious intent to win really isn't a thing. At least not from my experiences. US floor rules are way more adamant about not having electronics, so I kinda lost my main point of reference here. The deck is a pretty standard Brunhild build though, with the main confusing card being in English. But my opponent still wanted to cross-reference everything from Whispers of an Angel to Acolyte of the Sun, rather than just take what I said each did as their effect. I eventually just called the judge over and they ruled to pause the match, and I handwrite all my deck's cards down and we'd resume with no time loss after. Rather than deal with this compromise, my opponent simply scooped though. I do want to apologize to my opponent though, and I hope the rest of your GP experience went better than that round. Round 4 was against a green Hanzo, and where my first major blunder happened. Hanzo in general is a tricky matchup, and one mistake against Furry Sherry can be harder to recover from than it would be against other decks. Having a zero-cost response that just shuts out a rune can be crucial, and in all honesty is one of the only reasons Hanzo is such a great ruler choice for green, despite there being a lack of synergy in most of the color. You know, outside of them doing everything. Brunhild does have the tools to put Hanzo on the spot though, but the problem becomes having to deal with his resonators while he has the resources to protect them. So as the game goes on, it becomes harder and harder to stop him, with his roll reserves getting bigger and bigger each turn. For both game 1 and 2, I hard mulled for Blade of Faith to deal with early Jizo statues and attempted to get a sorceress in hand for pressure. After that, I tried to get 2 runes up as quick as possible to make her boost live and force removal through either Rapid Fire and Sandstorm or a 2-card comboed Elemental Blast. I hedged my bets on Hanzo not having Evil Elemental in his main, and tried to play around Violas since my best chance to hedge a win would be in the mid to late game off of a Brune Judgment or an Ear Summon where I could try to re-establish my board. That unfortunately didn't happen though. 7 Disciples became a pain in the ass to deal with and was able to secure him the game 1 win, as I couldn't overcome them gaining multiple symbol skills and lacked the removal options to deal with Lorite and other things getting cancelled. Maybe I shouldn't have swapped out Psycard in my side for the big golem board wipe, but I can't imagine he would have stuck on the board long enough to be useful. I honestly think White has plenty of unique outs to deal with these 7 jackasses. I just didn't think to add any of them, and my deck lacking a real boss monster probably didn't help either. Another major problem I had was not properly distributing counters off of evolution. I opted to make hair as big as possible when I probably should have laid things out in a way that forced several 800 to 1000 attack beaters at my opponent's face, rather than hedge everything on a 1.5k hair and a 1.2 ear. I might have been able to turn game 1 around had I done so, or at least gotten rid of his disciples. Game 2 was a trash fire. I tried to flip Odin's Judgment and somehow blanked on Sealing Scroll's existence, thinking it had already been played. Everything was just kinda downhill from there. Disciples landed, my field was continually cleared, and even if I could have stabilized, my opponent had reached well over the 4k starting life threshold off of the 900 drains from each Apostle swing. Round 5 was on stream, so please go watch as I play into the absolute hardest of counters, if only because my opponent had 3 main deck Belial. See, as I miss a trigger I don't care about because I run no darkness in the main deck, and be amazed as trying to re-establish a board against Lucifer proves to be difficult. Although, honestly, I think the best ways to deal with Lucifer are as follows. Have cards that replace themselves when played. Draw and search effects are pretty good against a deck that's going to try and force you to top deck. There's currently no reliable instant speed discard to hurt you for continually digging. And if given the opportunity, Brunhild can set up a decent draw engine through her resonators and runes. Have a play each turn that forces a response. Unless you're against hard aggro, Lucifer wants to be able to freely pick your hand apart. If you have resonators on the field that can continually pelt him, he'll be forced to choose between ripping apart your hand or dealing with your field presence. That said, avoid going too wide, because once the number of creatures on your field starts to outweigh the cards in your hand, the obvious response is going to be to just wipe your field instead. Avoid having multiple copies of the same card in hand. This is mostly just to play around early game Look of Corruption into Glint of Insight combos. Lastly, avoid putting Lucifer under 1,500 life or so until you know you can kill him. There are several Darkness Resonators that become exponentially stronger the closer Lucifer is to death. Forcing Belial to be restricted to a 6-cost base can be the difference between a Brunhild flip into a field restock or getting Evil Elemental on your main recovery option. I don't feel like this matchup is as horribly one-sided in Lucifer's favor as a lot of people make it out to be. It just requires some specific responses from Brunhild to pay off. You can't just autopilot a strategy and hope to win against an unfavorable matchup. That's part of the reason why they're considered an unfavorable matchup. I ended up losing this round even though I was roughly 1 or 2 attacks away from game in both matches. Honestly, I'm kinda content with this. Lucifer was going to be the biggest uphill battle here, and being able to push a game as relatively close as I got it felt good. My last round was against Arthur Machines. While I personally think Arthur is still lacking compared to Loki, if you sleep on Machines, they can quickly overpower you and control the pace of the game pretty easily. The most important part of the matchup is to remove whatever Machines have counters on them before they become potential problems. Blade of Faith is the obvious go-to here, since it can get rid of anything, and combat tricks like Miscalculation or Chastising can punish a buff attacker. The main goal here is to go wide and end the game before Mystery Box comes out, since that all but guarantees either a Lancelot board wipe or a bunch of overpowered attackers. If you can't close out before then just sit on Odin's Judgment, since blue lacks protection and cancels without splashing green. There's not much else to do in this matchup. Machines are just a deck that demands responses lest they snowball into their mid-game dominance. As long as you don't let Vivian or Lancelot build up too many counters, you can easily prevent yourself from losing. I hit 10th place, although if anything I landed the highest out of the 9 Brunhild decks at the event, even if most of my run was a luck sack. I have no idea how I dodged Lucifer until the 5th round, considering it wasn't until after the 5th round that my record became questionable. I don't really regret taking Brunhild, even if she was expected to not do well against Lucifer, though. Having a chance to play her and experiment with all the goofy shit White has was rather fun, and I ended up with a good 3 or 4 variants of the deck after the GP to continue messing with. There are a few changes I would make to the main deck, though. For starters, it needs some actual boss monsters. The deck doesn't spam runes as quickly as the aggro variant of the deck from Vegas that it shares its shell with. Zhang Zhang is a decent choice. He's searchable by Orphica, gives you a secondary use for gems, and if your life gain is going properly, he becomes a non-chant form of removal. Despite my sort of distaste for her, Mistletoe makes for a decent boss as well, and synergizes decently with Diverse Evolution. If you play her and then use her will ability to make Evolution only cost a blue, you can revive an ear and then another thing through ear for a guaranteed plus 300, assuming you don't target another human or Valkyrie. One variation I've been experimenting with uses quick cast resonators to set up the field during your opponent's turn, and then swing in on the start of your turn while they're hopefully tapped out. While she can't rival the stats of either Sorceress or Hare, IU makes for an annoying to deal with 2 costs that can give you a decent amount of life gain when she enters, depending on how many runes you have up. And she can also dodge Odin's Judgment by returning to your hand. There are a few other quick cast resonators, but none of them really give enough benefits to shift the entire focus of the deck to them. If anything, IU is really the only sort of splash quick-cast resonator that I found beneficial. Truth be told, I think this deck would work better with Adam as the ruler. Just Brunhild currently has the better rune lineup thanks to Blade of Faith and Odin's Judgment. Diverse Evolution is a disgustingly strong rune, and Omniscient Stone makes it easy for light-based decks to work with the card without much issue. Honestly, the more single-color cost runes that are created, the stronger Adam and Brunhild will get because of it thanks to this stone. While I'm sad this is probably my last Force Major that I'll be able to participate in, I'm content with how I performed. The tournament was fun, everyone was friendly, and it reminded me why I enjoyed this community as much as I do. The head of ARG stated that this would be the last non-summer invitational event they host for Force of Will, but said that, "I have been told the tournament scene will continue in North America despite what happens in Asia." So while I'm glad the game will continue to live on in the States, this feels like a weird confirmation for things I already knew. Force of Will is dead in Japan. It's depressing that every bit of news or information I've heard about this game has been secondhand and trickled down by store owners. There's zero interaction from the company with the players outside of a bold-faced lie that happened over a month ago. A company that owes a large part of its longevity to its transparent PR and player engagement can't even be asked to keep players in its own country informed. The precedence this sets isn't a good one. Even if Japan's sales were only a tiny portion of the game's overall gross income, cutting it off, canceling its tournament scenes, and then removing all information regarding Worlds builds a very anti-consumer face. Competitive games only stay afloat if one of two things happens. The community supports it themselves, or the company supports the community. As a TCG, Force of Will needs way more of that second one. Without sponsored events, pre-releases, and other customer appreciation gimmicks, no one is going to want to play. Events will get left in the hands of store owners, and many of them still seem to be hung up over bullshit that happened over 4 years ago, instead of putting in the work to actually build up a base. ARG cutting ties also eliminates one of the easiest ways for a store or players to try and build a community through their event kits. That's not to say you need these things, but giving players an ease of access to pick up your slack is probably the second best thing you could do, other than just not destroying the community yourself. Force has to be one of the most anime kawaii-ass cockroaches I've ever seen. Through sheer dedication and perseverance of its player base, it's survived blunder after blunder to the point where we're finally starting to see a variety at major events. I just hope the company realizes it should stop cutting off the legs of its community before it no longer has any left to stand on.